The other day, a colleague of mine, a really good science writer, offered to send me an advanced look of his next book, and he said he could send it either as a PDF or as a Kindle file. And I thought, wow, how civilized. What a great thing it is to live in the future where you can actually get an electronic book and look at it on these devices that millions of us carry now. But it got me thinking about the differences in the ways that I've started to think about electronic books and physical books and virtual books. So, as an example, the guy who founded the Internet Archive, Brewster Kahle, has announced that he's going to build a collection of every published book in the world. It's this super romantic Noachian quest, right? He calculates there's hundreds of millions of these, and he's never going to get all of them, but he's going to get tens of millions, he says, and you catalog them, put them in a box, put the box into a cargo container, put the cargo containers into a temperature, climate-controlled, humidity-controlled warehouse, and you leave them there. So why do you do that? Well, you do it, my argument, I guess, would be in case the power goes off, right? I mean, our tablets, our devices, in the end, are limited by how much electricity they have in them. Now, I got yelled at about this at work. One of my colleagues said, you don't need every book if the power goes off. You just need the one book, the one that tells you how to turn the power back on. But that actually gets at a kind of a fundamental problem with the transmission of information across time, right? And there are a bunch of interesting groups working on stuff like this. The Long Now Foundation is one of them, but it reminds me of one of my favorite stories from the history of technology. I don't actually know all the details of this, or even if in fact the story is apocryphal or even remotely true, so I make up parts of this to make it into a better story, but just bear with me because it'll be good. There's this town called Lowell in Massachusetts, and it's still there, it's a nice town, but it kind of got its start as a mill town. It was one of the first places where there were automated looms. This was really before electricity. It was early and before steam even, early industrial revolution. So what powered these looms was water. The town was basically built up on this network of canals and a river, and that would turn big cranks, and the cranks would turn belt drives up in the ceiling, and those would run the looms. But the problem they had was that whenever there would be a storm, the river would overflow, it would destroy the mill. And so they were really worried about this because they didn't know when the next storm would be. So they had to figure out a way to build a system that would gate the canals, but that would tell people how it would work. And they didn't know how to give them the instructions because they didn't know when it would happen. Anyway, decades later, a century later, whatever, the storm finally gets there. The people who run Lowell are in a huge panic. They know that there's a gatehouse that'll close these gates somehow, but they don't know how it works, and nobody's figured out how it works in however long it's been. Finally, they crack open the lock, they break into the gatehouse, they play their lantern across the inside, and inside this gatehouse, sitting on top the main gate, is a metal plaque and a hammer and a steel rod coming out of the floor. And the metal plaque says, take the hammer, hit the pin. Right? The simplest piece of instruction you can imagine. They go in, they take the hammer down, they hit the pin, it closes the gate, they save the city. Okay, so that's transmitting information across time, right? Well, a while back, my grandmother died. My grandmother was a professor of library science at UC Berkeley. She was a communist rabble-rouser. She spoke half a dozen languages. She traveled all over the world. She was an amazing lady. And by the time she died, she was in a 2-room apartment that was caked with books. I did a rough count. It was something like 20,000. I mean, they were wall-to-wall, floor-to-ceiling. And it was my job and the job of the rest of my family to clean the place when she died. And as I was doing it, I realized that, you know, as she got older, her genius, her brilliant mind and her memory really faded. And what she had constructed with these books was a literal version, a physical version of what's called a memory palace. It was a memorization, a mnemonic technique that they taught like monks in the Middle Ages, where you would build a virtual place, a location in your head, and you would store memories and use those locations as a way to recollect stuff. They did a riff on it in the new Sherlock Holmes series last season too. But Grandma had built a physical memory palace, right? Those books were her memory palace. And it made me realize that my books are like that at home too, that I have my books on shelves rigorously organized because I'm my grandmother's grandson, and they're my memory palace. I use their physical locations. I use the look of those books to remember what's in them, which makes it very hard to have an electronic version. So what I've started to do is make decisions about what books I'm going to get electronically and what books I'm going to get physically. Authors who I've already collected a bunch of books by, because I have that nerd collector compulsion, I buy those books. I get a lot of books about cities and urban theory, and I like the maps, and I like to look at those, and I want to remember that information in a certain way, so I tend to buy those. But like almost all the new science fiction is electronic. The new stuff for work is electronic. My comic books have gone almost completely electronic. And that sort of brings me back to what Brewster Kahle's doing. Because I feel like he doesn't trust the mnemonic, right? He doesn't believe that the virtual world, that the bits will provide a kind of information for him, will provide memory for him. I think I'm worried about something different. I'm not worried about forgetting what's in those books. I'm worried about forgetting how to remember what's in those books. I think for me, there's always going to have to be a difference between the information and the artifact.